In episode 55, titled Prepare for Audits, Ethics, Classification, PCI DSS, Incident Reporting, audits are treated as evidence-based reviews of control claims rather than as surprise interrogations. An audit is essentially a structured conversation where an organization says, "This is how we manage risk," and then backs that statement with artifacts that show the controls exist and operate consistently. When reporting systems, dashboards, and data pipelines feed leadership decisions, those systems become part of what an auditor evaluates because they influence how risk is seen and acted on. The goal is to make audit readiness feel like normal operational hygiene, not a last-minute scramble driven by anxiety. An audit is built on the idea that claims must be provable, and provable means evidence that a third party can understand and follow. A control claim might be that access is limited, changes are reviewed, sensitive data is protected, and incidents are escalated quickly. And each of those claims has an evidence shape. Evidence shapes include logs that show activity, approvals that show review happened, configuration records that show a control is in place, and change histories that show the control stayed in place over time. When evidence exists only as memory or informal statements, audits become stressful because the burden shifts from showing proof to asking for trust. Evidence-based thinking keeps the conversation grounded in what can be demonstrated rather than what is hoped. Data classification is the labeling system that translates sensitivity into handling rules, which is why it is central to audit conversations. Classification answers what the data is, how sensitive it is, and what protections are expected, so the organization can apply consistent controls across storage, reporting, and sharing. Labels vary by organization, but the logic is consistent. Higher sensitivity implies tighter access, stronger monitoring, stricter retention discipline, and clearer rules about where the data is allowed to flow. Classification also reduces ambiguity in reporting work because it makes it obvious when a dashboard is touching sensitive material that deserves additional review and restrictions. When classification is mature, the question is not, "Is this data risky?" but which label applies and which rules come with it. Classification is not only a tag on a table. It is a practical agreement about how data is handled at every step from source to report. A field that contains personally identifiable information, PII, changes the expected controls even if the dashboard only shows aggregated counts, because the underlying data still exists and can be accessed by someone with the right permissions. This is where audits often get specific, because auditors look for consistency between the label and the real controls applied in storage, transit, replication, and access management. When classification is vague or inconsistently applied, controls tend to drift, and drift is what auditors interpret as unmanaged risk. A clear classification model makes it easier to defend why data is stored where it is stored and who can see it. Ethics sits next to compliance because allowed is not always the same as appropriate, especially in data work that touches people's behavior and identity. Ethical handling starts with minimizing harm, which includes limiting collection, limiting retention, and limiting access to what is genuinely needed for the stated purpose. Respecting user expectations matters because surprises erode trust, even when a technical argument can be made that the data use was lawful or permitted. Ethical posture also reduces audit friction because it encourages conservative choices that align with least privilege and data minimization, both of which auditors tend to view favorably. When teams build systems that can be explained in plain language without embarrassment, the audit narrative becomes cleaner and more credible. Ethics also shows up in the way reporting is framed, because dashboards can drive actions that affect customers, employees, and partners. A metric that labels users as risky or suspicious may be useful, but ethical handling expects explainability, proportional response, and protections against misuse. Ethical practice includes transparency in definitions and limitations, so decision-makers understand what the metric does and does not prove. It also includes careful handling of sensitive categories where aggregation, redaction, or access partitioning can prevent unnecessary exposure. Auditors may not grade ethics directly in every framework, but ethical discipline often produces the same artifacts auditors want, such as clear purpose, controlled access, and traceable decisions. Payment card-related data introduces a specific scope lens because Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard PCI DSS expectations attach when cardholder data or sensitive authentication data is present. Scope is not only about a payment application. It includes wherever that data is stored, processed, or transmitted, and it can extend into reporting systems if dashboards pull transaction details that include in-scope elements. Many organizations find that reporting creates accidental scoop expansion, such as exporting payment-related fields into analytics tables or logs that are less controlled than the primary payment environment. A disciplined scope mindset reduces that risk by clearly identifying which systems are in scope, which fields trigger scope, and which reporting outputs are allowed to include only aggregated, non-sensitive representations. In audits, clear scope boundaries are often as important as the controls themselves, because unclear scope makes control coverage impossible to defend. The phrase payment dashboard sounds harmless, but under PCI DSS, it can become a compliance focal point if it draws from in-scope sources and exposes details beyond what is necessary. Scope thinking often hinges on data elements, not intent, so even well-meaning reporting can raise requirements if it handles prohibited fields or stores them longer than needed. This is why auditors ask how reporting is designed, what data is pulled, and what controls govern the reporting pipeline, including access reviews and change management. When reporting systems use tokenized values, aggregated counts, and strict role separation, the compliance posture is easier to explain because sensitive elements are not propagating into low-control environments. Clear documentation of what the dashboard contains, and just as importantly, what it never contains, becomes a powerful scope defense. Incident reporting paths are part of audit readiness because audits assume controls fail sometimes, and they evaluate how quickly the organization detects and responds. A reporting system that shows anomalies, data freshness issues, or suspicious access patterns often becomes an input to incident detection, which means it needs defined escalation routes. Incident reporting includes who receives the alert, how severity is classified, what time expectations exist for acknowledgement, and how evidence is preserved for investigation. In many environments, confusion about escalation causes delays, and delays increase impact. So auditors look for structured workflows that demonstrate repeatability. Clear escalation paths also reduce internal conflict because responsibilities are defined before a high-pressure situation occurs. Evidence organization is the practical bridge between we have controls and we can prove controls. And audits tend to reward organizations that can produce artifacts quickly and consistently. Useful evidence includes system logs, access review records, change approvals, incident tickets, configuration baselines, and attestations that demonstrate a control was reviewed and accepted. Evidence also needs context, such as dates, owners, and scopes, because a screenshot without a timestamp or a report without a version marker is weaker than it looks. When evidence is scattered across personal drives or informal channels, audits become a hunt, and hunts increase the chance of missing key proof. Organized evidence makes the audit conversation shorter and calmer because the organization can show, not merely tell. A payment dashboard scenario makes audit readiness tangible because it ties together classification, scope, access control, and change management in a single artifact that leaders care about. Imagine a dashboard used to monitor payment volume, refund rates, and transaction failures, where the business wants rapid insight without exposing cardholder data or sensitive authentication details. In a well-governed design, the dashboard consumes curated aggregates, uses strict access controls, and carries metadata that states its refresh timing, scope boundaries, and the sources of truth it references. If an auditor asks how accuracy is validated, evidence can include reconciliation totals, change records for metric definitions, and access review logs showing only authorized roles can view underlying detail. The scenario highlights that audit readiness is not a separate system. It is the same system with traceability turned into a first-class feature. Procedures must align with policy because auditors often test whether practice matches documentation, and mismatches are credibility killers. A policy might say, access is reviewed quarterly, changes require approval, and incidents are escalated within defined windows. But an auditor will look for records that show those actions occurred as described. When procedures drift from policy, teams may still be acting responsibly, but the organization cannot prove it in the language the audit expects. Alignment also protects teams from conflicting expectations because a clear procedure provides a stable way to meet policy without improvisation. Consistent alignment creates a narrative that holds together, where policies describe intent and procedures show how intent becomes repeatable behavior. Access control validation often becomes a recurring audit topic because access is both high risk and easy to misunderstand without evidence. Validation includes periodic reviews that show who has access, why they have access, and whether that access remains appropriate for their role. It also includes proof that sensitive datasets and dashboards are segmented so broad audiences see only what they need, while restricted audiences can access deeper detail under tighter oversight. Auditors tend to look for a pattern over time, not a single moment, so review records and change histories become important. When access validation is routine and recorded, the organization can show that least privilege is not a slogan but an operating discipline. Exceptions are inevitable, and tracking exceptions is what turns them from hidden risk into approved risk decisions. An exception might allow a temporary access grant, a delayed patch window, a retention extension for legal reasons, or a controlled deviation from a standard process during a high-impact event. Auditors usually accept that exceptions exist, but they want to see that exceptions are documented, approved by appropriate authority, time-bounded when possible, and revisited rather than forgotten. Exception tracking also protects teams because it shows decisions were intentional and reviewed, not accidental or negligent. A visible exception record can prevent a small deviation from turning into a permanent gap that nobody owns. Retroactive documentation undermines credibility because it signals that evidence was created to satisfy the audit rather than to support real governance. Auditors are trained to look for timing cues, consistency markers, and natural operational artifacts that accumulate during real work, such as tickets created during incidents, approvals generated during change windows, and logs produced by normal system operations. When documentation appears suddenly and uniformly right before an audit, it raises questions about whether the controls were operating consistently earlier. This does not mean documentation must be perfect from day one, but it does mean that the organization benefits from building evidence habits that produce records as a byproduct of routine operations. Over time, Authentic evidence becomes easier to produce because it already exists in the normal workflow. Telling the data story from source to report is one of the most valuable audit skills because it connects technical reality to control claims in a way non-specialists can follow. The story usually begins with the source system, then explains how data is collected, transformed, and stored, and then shows how the final dashboard or report is produced, including refresh timing and validation steps. The narrative becomes stronger when it includes traceability markers such as dataset version labels, change records for metric definitions, and lineage references that show how data moved across systems. This kind of story also reveals where controls apply, such as where access is restricted, where logging occurs, and where approvals are required for changes. A clear story reduces audit friction because it prevents gaps where an auditor wonders what happens in between. An audit-ready evidence checklist can be recited as a mental sequence that emphasizes proof, consistency, and traceability without turning into a bureaucratic ritual. The sequence begins with classification and scope clarity, then moves to access controls and periodic access reviews, then to change management records that show approvals and version history. It also includes incident reporting pathways and records of actual escalations, plus validation artifacts like reconciliations, counts, and refresh confirmations that tie reported numbers back to sources. Evidence is strongest when it is time-stamped, attributable to owners, and consistent across reporting layers, because that combination shows controls are operating, not merely described. When this sequence is internalized, audit readiness becomes a steady posture rather than a panic response. To conclude, one practical step is organizing a single evidence folder today in a way that mirrors how an auditor thinks, so the most important proof is easy to find under pressure. A well-organized set typically includes access review records, change approvals, lineage notes, incident tickets, and validation artifacts that tie key dashboards to their sources of truth. The act of organizing is valuable because it exposes gaps, such as missing approvals, unclear ownership, or weak traceability markers, while there is still time to address them through normal process. Over time, that one organized folder becomes a template for other datasets and dashboards, and audit readiness becomes less about heroic effort and more about consistent evidence hygiene. Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.